Hey, this is Jet. Welcome to this edition of After 5, a music, art, and entertainment podcast picking up where my radio show left off. Welcome, everybody. You're listening to After 5, and we have with us our next guest. We have Alia O'Brien of the band Blood Ceremony. Welcome to the show, Alia.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So first of all, tell us a little bit of about the band's history, how you guys kind of all met up and started Blood Ceremony.
Sure. I mean, this would have been like 2005 probably, so it's been a minute. And we initially kind of grew out of an old project of Sean's. He had he was kind of playing with some friends, kind of doing some, he had some doom projects. I think he was listening to a lot of Witchfinder General, Witchcraft, Electric Wizard, that sort of thing. And of course, the proto doom, early, heavy rock, heavy metal stuff too, I think was in heavy rotation for him. So he was he was playing a lot in that idiom when I met him. And I would have met him, probably in 2002 or what have you. And I was studying music at the time, classical music, but I always loved old school heavy rock. So that was sort of where I was coming from. And I think Sean knew I was into that kind of stuff. And I remember he was getting a new band off the ground, Blood Ceremony. They had a different singer at the beginning. And of course, the lineups completely changed from sort of when we first began. Right. But Sean had asked me to come in. I think he'd been listening to this Witchcraft song from their first album, I believe, where they had it was kind of like a slower jam session with flute. And he was like, "Would you want to come and play on one of our songs and do something like that?" I was like, "Yeah, sure." But I also had a combo organ at the time, so I kind of brought that. And then one song turned into multiple songs, and I just sort of became a permanent member of the band. And then the old singer moved to India for a bit, and so I took over on vocals, and that sort of became the band's first incarnation. Me, Sean, and me on keyboards, flute, and vocals, Sean on guitar, and then our original bassist Chris Landon, and our original drummer Jeremy Finkelstein. So that was sort of how it began. And we, our sound was inspired by that kind of old school heavy rock, but also kind of the newer bands that were engaging with those sounds, but in their own way, maybe through the lens of doom rock, doom metal. Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about yourself. Now, you mentioned that you are a flautist and you play organ and you sing and all these things.
Yeah.
So how, tell us a little bit how you got into playing both flute and organ, and then actually, well, you told us how you actually were able to find a band that was, willing to do this and how it turned out.
Yeah, the band found me very, very organic, and it's sort of my dream, I always loved music, from a young age. My grandmother had a piano, so we didn't have one, but my grandmother did. And I would just figure out songs on the piano. I was never an amazing piano player. I did study it as a kid, a lot of kids do, but I wasn't, I don't know. I found it very daunting, but I loved figuring out songs on piano. So I always sort of had an ear for music, and I just loved playing it, but I loved playing it kind of on my own terms. And then jump forward, in school band, as many people do, they get assigned an instrument. And I think I'd wanted to play saxophone originally, because I was that's a rock instrument. That's a fun instrument. That's the centerpiece of the jazz, the jazz quartet or whatever. But I ended up getting handed flute instead. And I was kind of bummed out about it. And then my dad was like, "Well, have you heard Jethro Tull?" And I was like, "No." I was probably 12, 13 at the time. And so he got me Thick as a Brick, or maybe I got it out of the library. I can't remember. But yeah, and the rest is history. So I just sort of went down the Tull rabbit hole, the Herbie Mann rabbit hole. So that's sort of how I got into playing that kind of stuff. But of course, you don't go And then I just got possessed by the flute and music and soloing, and I played a lot of jazz. And then I ended up going to university for classical music, but like it wasn't the world for me. It's, it was a lot of sort of fine tuning like the technique and not a lot of like making my own musical choices. So yeah, I kind of parted ways pretty soon after I started down that path. And then I just played with local bands. That sort of like that became my musical outlet.
And now you said you did attend university, and I did read some kind of past article where you were working on both a master's and a PhD. And
yeah.
So tell us what happened, Alia.
I did it. I'm a doctor now. Yeah, I sort of switched modes. So like I went from studying performance, which I realized, no, I want to do performance on my own terms, in my own way. I want to be able to write. I want to be able to solo. So instead of doing performance in school, I actually switched into studying ethnomusicology, which is like essentially the study of people making music, but it's kind of like anthropology, but with a focus on music. Mm-hmm. So that's like, yeah, I mean, I did my master's, I did my PhD. I've done like now decades of schooling. But it was really nice because like all the time I got to kind of like focus on music, and the fun thing about ethnomusicology is you get to kind of like talk to other people about like what music means to them. And it's very like life affirming in a lot of ways, even though the academy is a very stressful hierarchical place to be. Like the work itself was really fun. So yeah, I just can't escape music in all of its forms.
So how does like the understanding of those elements that you studied in school play into like your musical career now?
I mean, it's interesting. Like I studied a lot of like for my research, I studied some like Middle Eastern music, and actually our bassist, our current bassist Lucas, who's been in the group for a very long time now, actually since our second album, he studied some Persian classical music. So me and him both have that thing in common. Cool. And it's actually just, it's a different modal system, it's a different tuning system, and it can really open your ears to like different possibilities when soloing and writing and just studying music from all over the world from different eras. It can really it really expands your mind and sort of like corrects notions of like what's musically right and musically wrong that you get a lot when you're studying classical music, but also like that you kind of get in like really in like sort of more traditionalist like rock circles too, like sort of like playing by people that play by the books. So I mean, in that sense, I think it's encouraged us to keep challenging ourselves as players and writers. Yeah.
So let's talk about this new album of yours, The Old Ways Remain, releasing May 5th off of Rise Above Records. Is there some kind of like theme to this album, Alia?
Yeah, I mean, the theme's sort of baked into that title, The Old Ways Remain, which actually comes from, it's a lyric from one of our older songs, I think from the Eldritch Dark, if I'm not mistaken, but it's all blending together a little in my brain at this point. Like on one hand, we see this album as, of course, like we're experimenting with a lot of new sounds that we haven't used on albums previous, but we also kind of felt like going back to like some of the sounds that we got on that very first album of ours that was released in 2007. So kind of going back to our own old ways as a band, like our roots and kind of like the kind of things we did that maybe drew people in initially and that, were very like intuitive to us. Of course, like we always play with ideas of sort of like, pagan imagery, witchcraft, these sort of like pre-Abrahamic, belief systems, traditions, that sort of thing in our lyrics. So of course there's that element. And then there's just this idea that like, sometimes musically you have to look to the past to look forward. And there's a bit of that too. We're drawing from a lot of different musical influences that, come out of maybe like, the 60s, the 70s, but kind of bringing them into the present in a unique way and like mixing and matching them in a way that like wouldn't have happened maybe in the era, but are, we all listen to music from all over all over music's history now. So, you know, it's a lot easier to imagine certain sounds being combined, you know, like freaky, sleazy saxophone solo, like, you know, woven into a song that's like, you know, a bit krautrocky, but also like a bit doomy, like, you know, drawing from the old to breathe life into the new.
And on this album, then, who contributed to the writing? I mean, was this something that was an all-around thing, or was it Sean and you? Or
yeah, it was a bit of both. I would say that like a lot of the songs were sketched out by me and Sean. I'd say like the majority Sean, and then there are a couple songs that were like heavy. Like I wrote the majorities of Powers of Darkness. I wrote Hackett. And then, you know, like we all had ideas for different parts, you know, like Sean might come to the table with a song that's like fully sketched out, but then maybe I have an idea for a little turnaround or something. So that's often how we've worked. And like the same goes for Lucas. I believe like one of the main riffs in Eugenie, that was a Lucas riff. So that was like a collab between him and Sean. But really, like, you know, it's so funny. It's like ultimately some of the things are really fleshed out when we come together and jam. So it's like almost hard to imagine some parts being what they are without Mike on drums or without Lucas part on bass. So it really, you know, there's sort of like the architecture of the song that like we come to the table with, but then there's like the actual song that gets sort of like churned out on the other end. And really, I think it comes down to everyone's playing.
So what about lyrics now? Did you write lyrics on this one, or was that something Sean did as well?
Mostly Sean's the one writing the lyrics. I did write the lyrics for Hackett. I've penned lyrics for a couple songs, mostly the ones I've written. But Sean's really like, Sean has an ear for poetry. He's always been a sort of a literary enthusiast, and he's just got a knack for it. Like, you know, I like writing lyrics fine, but it's not something I necessarily enjoy. But Sean really, he's so good at conjuring up imagery from films, from sort of rare weird fiction from, you know, turn of the century that he's procured. Sean's a bit of an antiquarian book enthusiast, so he's got a real flair for like taking ideas from weird moments in film and literary history and like building a really cool atmospheric song around the concepts behind those things. So that's largely Sean's territory. And I know, like, you know, some of the songs from this album, just as has been the case in the albums previous, come straight out of like Eugenie's, based on, you know, sort of like sleazy films by the same title. And same with Powers of Darkness is based on quite a rare book by the same name. So yeah.
So how do you like emit the emotions when singing someone else's lyrics?
Yeah, well, I mean, we kind of like go back and forth, you know, when writing, and Sean will sort of test different lyrics with me, and we'll kind of go into the mood or what we're trying to capture, that sort of thing. So, and at this point in time, you know, our themes have remained quite like, you know, kind of cohesive over the past few albums. So it's become kind of second nature to kind of like conjure a feeling from the lyrics. I kind of know where Sean's coming from most of the time, and if I don't, like, we'll kind of work that out together.
So tell us a little bit about the musical and lyrical journey that this particular album takes us on.
Sure. I mean, it's an up and down labyrinth through I think I would say like different emotions and sort of different tonalities, both sort of musically and lyrically. So like the album starts out with a song that's sort of like more, we always like to start with a bit more of like a rock song. a riff oriented song, a song that's really like sort of heavy on the guitars to draw the ear in, and just to also give that first sort of like thrust of energy. And I would say that like the vocal range probably matches that too. Like it's a song where I get to really like belt it out more than perhaps others, which has been the case on the last few albums too. That's sort of the way it's gone about. And I'm actually pulling up our track listing so I can. So like the Hellfire Club was sort of, this was maybe this track. I mean, musically, it's the banger to start the album. Mm-hmm. Lyrically, it's, you know, digging back into this idea of like secret societies, and, you know, people are paranoid about sort of, you know, covert groups of, you know, politicians in high places making decisions without, you know, considering the will of the people. And this idea, you know, this sort of paranoia about these groups has always existed. And the Hellfire Club is sort of gestures towards one such group that's sort of been written about a lot in history. And of course, we wrote this song, we had the title, and then I think Stranger Things came up with there's a theme of the Hellfire Club in the most recent season of Stranger Things, but we're like, you know what, let's just keep it. Let's keep the title, let's keep the theme. It's kind of baked into the album and kind of like what we're getting at this point. So that's how it starts up and out. And then we kind of move into like some more garagey territory with Ipsissimus, which is sort of like this idea of this like ultimate self. But it's just a cool word. It's a cool word to sing. It's got a great sound to it. It's so repetitive. So it's like perfect for that, you know, a sort of like chanty chorus. And this song has one of my favorite moments that Sean wrote, a really sort of like zombies, Turtles-esque bridge. It's like very, very sort of dirgy, like lush vocal harmonies that I threw in that, you know, one of my favorite moments on the album. And then, okay, so Eugenie is like, it's like Blood Ceremony does krautrock, but with a weird twist. And this is getting more into camp, you know, like we don't shy away from campiness. And of course, this is based on the Eugenie films. I don't know if there were multiples. Mm-hmm. I think there might have just been the one. The story of her journey into perversion or something like that, 1970. So this is like a sort of sexploitation themed song. But this is like, you got to sort of camp it up. And of course, this is, we've always wanted to kind of do a jammier kind of like one note, like get into a groove kind of song. And Lucas had this idea to layer some toms on top of the existing drum kit. So we got a little wild and weird with the production on this song. I laid down some like really gritty organ sounds, and then we had our friend Joseph Shabazin come in and play some saxophone, because like if you're going to be telling a story about perversion, like you need a sleazy saxophone solo. So this was like and a first for us, because we've never had saxophone on an album before. So I don't know, it was fun. And like the thing is, like we kind of want to mix it up from track to track to keep people interested. And you know, we're big believers in this idea of like, you know, the album as a sort of like long playing listening experience. So we tried to sort of plan things so that they kind of complement each other and that there's lots of variety from one song to the next. We move into Lolly Willows, which we'd actually released before as a single, but I don't know if it got a lot of circulation, and we kind of recorded it as a demo. So we wanted to re-record it, get some sounds that we were really stoked on, and also we made a couple arrangement writing changes just to kind of mix it up. And it's more of a rock number too. And then we kind of moved to Powers of Darkness. I believe that ends the first side, and it's a poppier number that I wrote the verse and the bridge of, and then Sean wrote the chorus. And the chorus is kind of like this Slade-esque, has this sort of Slade-esque, you know, glam rock feel, and the verse and bridge are a bit more lilting. So again, kind of like moving from like the heavy to the garagey to the kraut rocky to kind of more, you know, glam rock, glam pop. So that's the first side. The second side I feel like is a little in some ways like darker. There's a lot more sort of Brit folk influences, like in the Bonfires at Bellacoom and Mossy Wood as well, I would say, which is actually a song that Sean's wife, Amy, who's a musician in her own right, wrote. Yeah, and like we got some short but sweet songs that are kind of rock, kind of pop, like Widdershins, Hecate, which I wrote, which is kind of like, you know, it's a weirder feel for us. So we had pedal steel on it. And then we end, as we kind of always do, with a bit of a like more like somber, sobering jam. And this one's Song of the Morrow. And this was when Sean showed me this song, I was like, I could hear all the harmonies in my head like immediately. So this was like one of my favorite songs to, in terms of arranging vocal harmonies. It was you know, it was wonderful, and it's such a kind of haunting song. And we try to end our albums with a bit of a haunting number. I don't know why. Start out with a heavy rocking number and just sort of like trail off into the abyss. So that's that.
So, you know, I really enjoyed Hecate. I mean, it does kind of have like that poppy sound to it, you know what I mean? It kind of, this is going to sound kind of weird, but it kind of reminded me of like the Brady Bunch or something back in those days. Yeah.
And someone said it was like the Poppy Family or something like that. But you know, I brought in I listened to a lot of kind of more like softer rock from the 70s too, like Steely Dan, and so there's like maybe a bit of that in here. But I also like the Kinks. I feel like I really wanted to do kind of a Kinks-esque verse, just, you know, a bit of a tonal change. And I love playing e-piano, so just like I really wanted like an e-piano forward song. And I also kind of wanted to create a bit of a opportunity to go a bit nuts with the backing vocal harmonies. And, you know, we were initially supposed to ship off to London, England to record this album. And because of COVID, we didn't get to, but then we had the opportunity to record it locally, which meant we had a bit more time and budget to play around with overdubs. So I was like, let's go for it. Let's do the like 4-part vocal harmonies.
Well, it was fun to listen to, but it's like you said, each song really has like their own personas to them, you know? So listening to, and then all of a sudden this one came on, and I was like, oh, this is kind of like, you know, sunshiny day. It was kind of fun, you know? So, so you mentioned that you did have a little bit of recording challenge, but it kind of worked out because you had more time and a better budget. And you also had a couple of guests on the album, and you had mentioned your sax player, but you had a couple other guests too, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, the sad thing is, like, we were going to go record at Toe Rag Studios with Liam Watson in London, and we'd done that for a previous album, and he's just like, there's no one like him, and there's nothing like his studio, Toe Rag. So we were sad about that, but then, we got to record locally in Hamilton, Ontario, actually, and because we were local, we brought in our friend Laura Bates, who's an amazing violin player who has played on some of our older albums, and she and Lucas have a metal project together as well called Bowler. Sean's wife, Amy, who's a vocalist and musician, did some backing vocals for cover that we did that is available as a 7-inch for the Die Hard, the Rise Above Die Hard release. Joseph Shabison played some saxophone. Our friend Michael Eckert played some pedal steel on Bonfires at Bellacoom. So we had a whole team of people coming, and like our friend Paul Cahias, who is an amazing guitarist, amazing musician, got a real ear for production, came in just to lend his ear and sort of help co-produce the album as well. That obviously wouldn't have been possible if we'd gone abroad to England. So, I mean, we definitely made the most of the circumstances, I think.
And you know, Ellie, I've been in this industry for a while, but really like these past few years, I've seen a bit of a resurgence in this kind of music, you know, among some newer artists, you know, the more rocky, psychedelic, folky. I don't really want to say retro, but yet that kind of vibe. So what do you think attributes to this?
I mean, I think, you know, something we were trying to capture with this album, and even just with the title and the themes that crop up, is that there is this idea, especially when people are feeling really dissatisfied by the present. And this is not in like a MAGA way, but it's like there's this tendency in general, like whether it's, you know, people looking to astrology as a sort of new spirituality to give meaning, or, you know, there's a tendency to kind of look to old things, maybe to try to recapture something of a time that like seemed like it was better. But I also think, so I think there's a bit of that, a bit of like this sort of nostalgia factor that actually helps people sort of like inject a bit of meaning and a bit of pizzazz into, you know, the troubled present times. But then I think there's also like, you know, a lot of music today sounds so perfect, so polished, so digital, everything's like meticulous. And it's almost like, you know, you hear these like AI covers coming out, and it's like, you know, that could easily be a song that's on the radio. Like everything sounds, you know, I don't want to say everything, but a lot of stuff that's sort of like, you know, climbing its way to the top 40. It's very, you know, there's a lot of perfection. There's this sort of addiction to fidelity, not universally, but like it seems to be prevalent in like ultra popular music. And so I think there's maybe people miss the human element that came with, you know, like the sort of flawed recording processes and, you know, the bare bones sort of like performances, and just sort of that came with music from the 60s and 70s. And like, I feel like people crave that. Like, I don't want to hear a voice that's perfectly in tune all the time. Like, I don't want to hear production that's like, without sort of like any errors or any, like, it's sometimes nice to hear the inner workings of production. I don't know. One of my favorite artists is Todd Rundgren, and I always loved his sort of like, you know, he's such a talented producer, but he also, his whole style was this sort of, especially with his own stuff for a while, was this sort of like DIY kind of like, you know, basement recording artist kind of vibe. So like, you hear these sort of like human moments in the production process, and I'm like, I love that. I don't know. I love lifting the veil of the whole process a little bit.
And I think you're right about that too. When you listen to, say, your album, for instance, it does kind of take it back to a time when everything seemed better, at least. Maybe because we were younger and didn't have as many responsibilities, but whatever it was, and it just kind of makes your mind feel better or something, you know. You just get this whole overall feeling, you know. It is I mean, it just, you get that great feeling from it, and I think your album does that very well.
Oh, thank you. Oh, well, thank you. That is our goal. So,
and now I always think, you know, art is important to an album as well, as it's the first thing you see on an album before diving into it. So tell us a little bit about the art on this album.
This is Aubrey Beardsley. It's a lesser known image by Beardsley, who we've always been a fan of. But it was just, you know, we were trying to figure out, do we go, like, we've collaborated with artists before, but I'm like, okay, it's the old ways remain. So it kind of actually makes sense to go to like an artist from the past, like with public domain art for this album. But secondly, Sean discovered this piece in a book of Beardsley's art that he had, and it was just like one of those things where we're like, well, we'll consider this as a possibility for the album cover. We'll look at some other options, and we just kept coming back to it. And there's something about like that hunched over figure with like this sort of like all the negative space in the image. It was just like we couldn't get it out of our minds, and so I think at the end of the day, we were like, I think this just needs to be the album cover.
And it fits perfectly with that album as well. And, you know, in closing, Alia, where can people learn about the band, as well as where they can find places to pick up the new album, where you're playing, and all that kind of stuff?
A couple, but, you know, we don't, in true sort of the old ways remain fashion, we don't have website per se, but we do have a Facebook page, Instagram. We're updating a lot on Instagram. We're also Rise Above Records website. They may have sold out of their copies of the album, but they have a lot of sort of our other stuff, like the previous albums, some of which are still available. And of course, if any more albums get released, that's a good place to go. Other than that, I mean, other than our social media, we also have Twitter. The other option is in terms of buying albums, go online to Amazon, Apple Music, wherever you can, Spotify, wherever you typically stream and buy albums from, and our stuff's all available there as well.
And there you have it. Blood Ceremony have a new album out May 5th called The Old Ways Remain off of Rise Above. You can learn more about what they're up to on their social sites. And Alia, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us, and we wish you and the band all the best.
Thank you so much.